Thank you very much, all. I am really humbled to be here, surrounded by so many good friends and really teachers and mentors. I see quite a few around here in the room. It is very moving for me to be here now. We're going to be talking about authenticity, beauty, and human well-being, and why there can be no good urbanism without good architecture. Does anybody know why there can be no good urbanism without good architecture? Anybody have any idea? Well, yes.
I have just an idea, which is that the architecture forms the personality and it helps understand who we are, where we came from, where we need to go. And if it's chaotic, what do you expect?
I think that's a great answer. Anybody else have any thought on that? I think it's even simpler than that. And when you look at a cross-section of a street, you'll see that there's more building than pavement for the most part in cities. Most of what we see on an urban street is buildings. Their visual neuroaesthetic impact is by far more dominant than that of the pavement. Pavement is kind of nothing, right? And let's not forget, and this is sort of culminating in what you said, traditional and classical buildings make up the best streets and places. So before we go any further, I would like to make some definitions, a little bit of clarity here. Classical, and classic. Capitalized classical is the name of a period or a style. Lowercase classical is a method, a really good way of doing something. And then classic is the best of its sort, classic coat, classic blazer, and so on. This talk is going to start with the origins of modernism, because that's kind of where we start getting into hot water. It's going to pass through very quickly what we're doing today. It's going to talk a little bit about the science to correct errors being made and synthesize a path forward. My greatest interest really is synthesizing where we go from here and what we do with all this stuff. So back in the 1750s, there was a fork in the road. People until then had been, it was clear that anything being designed was going to be designed for a pleasing experience. But people asked, is there some other type of aesthetic experience other than pleasure? What's the opposite of pleasure? Pain. So we can have an aesthetic experience based on pain or terror, and they called it the sublime. It's a very important distinction. The best example of sublime art is horror movies. You're completely wrapped up. Your senses, your emotions, your intellect, all wrapped up in fear and in terror and pain and so on. But in architecture, back in the 1750s, they drew what it could look like. And it was very large. Sublime architecture would be very large, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. That was Ledoux's library for France and Piranesi's Carcery, his prisons. Well, this is what we got today. Very large, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the architecture of pain and terror actually looks like by philosophical and experiential definition. Sorry if it's a little shocking, but how did we get here? And there is the question of, it all happened after World War I, and the big trauma in World War I was the industrialized killing. Well, that wasn't the first war where there was industrialized killing. Civil War in the United States was the first major war of industrialized killing, and we're still not over it. And we're not over World War I. The survivors of World War I went into this kind of new world with a new man. Women were relegated to two-dimensional arts and crafts at the Bauhaus because Gropius thought they couldn't handle 3 dimensions. And the teachers were bona fide strange, like Mr. Eaton over there. There was even a guy who in the 30s wrote an article, "Ornament is a Crime." And if you want to learn more about it, you can read all about it in James Stephen Curl, Making Dystopia. in 1939, Norman Bell Geddes, the designer of the General Motors Pavilion at the New York's World's Fair, saw the future. He built the American Street in the 1960s. And this is what we have now. This is in Beijing. So we're in great shape. We're not only contemplating, we are deep in the future. But that wasn't it. Then we had World War II. Everybody came back with PTSD from World War II. The hallmarks of modernism became the dissociation and the hatred of all things classical, as if modernism was protecting the poor people from authoritarian aristocracy, while at the same time they were running after corporate clientele. By the 60s, we had a reaction to it. This is Pruitt-Igoe, the same architect as designed the original Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Very large building, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. People simply couldn't really tolerate it. They had to work up the tolerance for it. We now live in a PTSD world. The impact of World War I continues psychologically. It's like waiting for the next bullet coming over the trench. Yeah, the text message is like waiting for a bullet. It's really amazing, but there are things in our lives where the parallels are there. And this is what we have now. Wolfsburg on the top left, something in London on the Thames, the other side of the Houses of Parliament, not far from there. And then the London skyline really is the poster child for architectural dysfunctional writ large. A voice of reason in all this has been Leon Krier. He has been a really great mentor and supporter of writing the book, The Art of Classic Planning. I wrote it simply because I was frustrated with the planning process. I just wanted to write, here, guys, do this, and just compile the stuff that had worked. Well, we've been building cities for 5,000 years. We have a pretty good idea of what makes them work, what to do. And everybody around the world has been doing pretty much the same thing. This is one of the first cities, Mohenjo-Daro, in Indus Valley. You can get around that pretty easy. On the other hand, we have been living intensively with technology for the last 200 years, have no clue whatsoever with what to do with it. And in fact, when technology enters the urban domain, it disrupts and it creates nowheres. So what modernist built environments have actually worked? Well, people around here say Reston, and it is pretty. It has a campus-like feel. It's in a rural context, or originally was in a rural context. And I'm talking about the residential neighborhood, not the new urbanist center, which isn't that bad, I suppose. But actually, Reston is more similar to temporary communities like hospitals, asylums, army camps, than anything urban. So we really haven't crossed that urban gap for a long, long time. So what has worked? The answer is the classical method. It's how we built cities before planning ruined them. And it's all based on the neuroaesthetic processing in the brain, where the environment of our emergence is being replayed through the art of good architecture. So we have at the Classic Planning Institute been applying, training, and researching the classical method knowledge bases. They include architectural literacy, classic planning, materials, and building methods. Nobody has built a traditional waterfront in probably 150 years since the Paris waterfront was completed. There's classic traffic planning. How do we move around without street lights and street signs and markings on the road? There's climatic, seismic, and pandemic resilience, which we know is found in traditional architecture. And then, of course, there's the design neuroscience, which kind of helps us. So values that are unique to the CPI is, number one, is that architecture is central to urbanism. Number two, we are genuinely holistic in the sense that we are working from a philosophically holistic basis of the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness, we are also uniquely into the integration of town and country. It's not garden cities, and it's not suburbs, and it's not sprawl. Town, country, they have an edge between them, and you don't want to walk more than half an hour from anywhere in town to countryside, which is kind of what happens in DC, certainly happens in Manhattan. You have the river and Central Park. Nowhere in town are you more than half an hour away from them. And then we've been discovering that crafts are essential. It could be that rather than everybody sitting behind a computer and living, finding their livelihood that way, manual construction might actually be essential for individual, for social, and even planetary well-being, because it requires different processes than the ones that are really harming the planet right now. So what we're doing is creating a synthesis, and this synthesis is a philosophy, aesthetic experience, and neuroscience. It's all in chapter 6 in the book, but it's not the first time this kind of synthesis has happened. The Greeks, by identifying this notion of the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness, actually defined what is holism. That original idea was translated by Vitruvius, who you might have heard of, and if you haven't, he was a Roman engineer. Engineers always save architecture, but the worst thing that's happened to architecture is engineering. He translated it as firmitas, utilitas, venustas, which in English in the Renaissance was translated as firmness, commodity, delight. Today's parlance, this means durability, long-term adaptive reuse, and neuroaesthetic fit. The idea of that holism is that if we change one, we're changing the whole. If we are measuring one, we're measuring the whole. And this is where science comes in, because with science, we can measure. You have, every one of you in the room, will be happy to know, you have a beauty center right here where your third eye should be. And it lights up when you see something pretty. When you see something ugly, nothing happens. It's really amazing. It's a 0 to 10. It's not a minus 10 to plus 10. So we're looking at a scale that is measurable, literally measurable, and it conforms to what the experience that people have. In other words, it'll light up and they will tell you, oh, that was beautiful at the same time. But because it's a holistic thing, it's also measuring the utility and the durability of something, and brings in to the conversation appropriateness, which simply doesn't exist in modern parlance, because everything has to be iconic, reflecting the time and reflecting the ego of the creator. So we're working on the neuroscientific validation of the classical method at the Institute. I'm working with Richard Taylor from University of Oregon, with Nikos Salingaros from University of Texas, and Anna Brielman from the Max Planck Institute. We're using multiple fractals, sequence of perception, attractance, avoidance in the course of walking, and the Brain's Beauty Center with the whole holistic business and the measuring and so on. All this takes us to asset allocation. What is planning? What is architecture? It's asset allocation. Where to put the bricks, where to put the sticks. So here we have a measurable method that can help inform us how to form things in a way that are beneficial for humans. Before we continue this, everybody here know what, is anybody, who knows what a fractal is? Okay. Fractals are things that, like you see the broccoli over there, there's the same pattern which occurs at different scales: small, medium, large, really big, really tiny. The Hokusai's wave is a fractal pattern. The ice crystal, the flame on the right. And then there's the Mandelbrot, Benoit Mandelbrot is the guy who brought fractals to our attention back in the 1980s. I see heads nodding. You're identifying yourself as such and such as. But the thing is that the landscape of our emergence was multiple fractal. The clouds are fractal, the mountains are fractal, the landscape, the rolling hills are fractal, the rocks are fractal, the trees are fractal, the ripples on the water are fractal. It's all fractal, multiple fractals, not one single fractal. It's multiple fractal. And these are processed in the first 50 to 100 milliseconds of any after seeing anything. And they immediately start this chain reaction of you're feeling good, you're feeling bad, you're releasing dopamine, you're releasing serotonin. So I'm officially in the drug business and I help people release dopamine. And this is where we go to have large releases of dopamine, pretty places around the world that we all love, and they're all multiple fractal. And the way it specifically works in the classical design is, and here's an example of two. There is the aqua and there's the pink. The aqua is a differentiating proportion, large, small. The pink is a punctuating proportion. It's the nail on the finger. It's the tip of the nose. It's the earlobe. It's the tip of the lion's tail. It's the tip of the leaf. Very common in nature. And you can see that these proportions occur. This is Doric order, Palladio specifically, Doric order. You can see that it occurs many times in different sizes. The way the brain processes this is the same way it processes a tree. When you're walking past Arthur Brown Jr.'s Commerce Building, your brain doesn't know that you're not looking at a tree. Going back to here, it's not only two. I said multiple earlier. There are for sure 5, maybe 7 such proportional systems going simultaneously. I'm not going to get into that now. But this kind of processing occurs in a cycle of 150 milliseconds as we walk. So every step you have 4 cycles like this, and it's like the little Google Streets thing, really get going and scanning. That's kind of what's going on as we walk down the street. And this is all research that we've been doing at the Institute. It's hot and it's not on the press yet. We're working to get it on the press. This is what we've done in interiors, whether it's commercial or residential. And we are on the urban level, we're applying eye tracking and visual attention software technology that you're going to hear about some more later on. For good urban spaces, specifically in the federal district, to evaluate proposals for their positive contribution to the built environment. And this is how it works. This is the Eisenhower Memorial by Gary down at the bottom, and you can see that the eye doesn't know where to stop. It's all over the place. And ultimately, where it does stop is nothing germane to that design. It doesn't tell you anything. Whereas in the traditional design, it's like a homing pigeon, goes straight to where you're going to see the inscriptions and the sculpture in a composition. How magical is that? So a few designs that we did for DC. This is a hotel for city center. And where some of the absolutely worst buildings in DC have been recently built, all operable windows and so on and so forth. When you're working in the classical method, you are actually creating something that's holistic, good for people. If it's going to look good, it's going to withstand the pandemic. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a design for the FBI block. It was requested by a council member a while back on Pennsylvania Avenue on the diagonal thing. It's a hotel. There are two wings that are commercial residential, and in the middle there's an opera. That shape is actually the same size as the Paris Opera. It's a huge block. It's the biggest block in town. So the only way we can get to the performance that we're looking for is through authenticity, designed for the Southwest waterfront, where if you're looking at it from the other side of the river, you're going to see a podium, a white stone podium on which sits the Capitol on top of Jenkins Hill, maybe the flagship of the DC thinking that we've had is this project, the Anacostia River project, where we extend the L'Enfant grid to connect to Anacostia, take out the freeways, narrow the river to the same width as the Seine, because the hydrogeological conditions are the same as in Paris, and throw a bridge across every quarter mile so you can actually turn this whole part of town into something walkable. This is, and all of this is done on public and on other kinds of land, not so much on private. This is what the Anacostia could look like in 50 years if we really wanted it. So this is asset allocation. That's what we do for the best human experience, and takes you to a recognition that is maybe striking, that the purpose of urbanism is to create a legacy of beautiful places for people. Now that's saying something. So we learned how we got here. We learned what science says. We know what we need to do. And the question is, if classic planning, how we built cities before, is the future of urbanism. Straight ahead. Join the movement. Buy the book. Call on us. Make beautiful. Thank you.
Time to ask them some questions at the reception after this as well. I would like to ask first question to prompt your conversation amongst each other. Could you discuss the role of scale in human need? And are we creatures that desire scale? There was the discussion of sublimity by Near about sublimity's relationship, the terror's relationship to modernity. But I wonder also, the Romantics discuss sublimity as being encountered in the weight of a waterfall, or the size of a mountain, or the beauty of the ocean, and its sheer scale. And so is it all terror, or is there awe, or are there other ways we can think about this? And are there ways in which it is both humane and classical to build at scale? I mean, especially because we are here in DC, a city of monumental architecture. So I was just curious if you guys could discuss a little bit how you consider the role of scale in building humane and beautiful architecture.
Those of us, and you can pick this up at the Classic Planning Institute, we teach architectural literacy. Rule number one is that everything comes in three sizes: small, medium, and large. And then there's stuff that's a little too large, like the National Mall is really large, but it's got edges along it that moderate that huge expanse. And specifically for DC, it is appropriate. And with starting at the Grant Memorial, poor Grant looking west, seeing everything that's way beyond, the whole idea of the mall is appropriate as a design element, is a very large design element, because this is a very large country. Tiananmen Square is horrific. It's just large. It has no character whatsoever, and certainly very little beauty around it. Zocalo in Mexico, huge. But they have an excuse there, because the Mexican culture, pre-Columbian, was based on terror. When the conquistadors came there first time, one of them counted 150,000 skulls and brackets around the place. So the idea of fear and terror is endemic, as part of the basic culture there. So you can say that is appropriate. And I don't think there are a lot of other squares. So far as the romantic commingling of the beautiful and the sublime, yes, it occurs mostly in German, who also thought about this stuff. They didn't make the distinction. And we say something is terribly good. Well, is it good or is it terrible? So there is this sort of loop in the language that confuses things when it comes to what ultimately is a neuroaesthetic experience. So things should be human scale. Human scale does not mean little. It means appropriate for humans. You walk into a cathedral, your soul fills the space. Could use even more, basically. So I'm sure I didn't answer your question.
You did excellently. Thank you.
Architecture is been said that it's concretized music. And when we talk about architecture in the urban context, it's not just standing there looking at something, but it's really walking past it. So there is this temporal flow of all this experience that you're experiencing as you walk. And walking is the essence of anything urban because that's the measure. So how long is it going to take me to get there? How long is it going to take me to get there? How easy is it to walk? And what am I going to see on the way? So choreographing that experience, composing it is like composing music, basically. What was the question?
Please go on. Just, continue to compose.
The point I'm making is that all of it is being confirmed by science. It's not about presupposition or previous concepts. The whole Greek idea was that we can reason through everything. The modernist idea is that we can't, we're limited. So we'll have machines do the counting. And when the machines are done, they corroborate what we knew before through reason, which is wonderful. At the end of the day, we are reaching, I think, at the end of this first round of 5,000 years of urban building, we're reaching some kind of consensus that is validated by machine counting of stuff. I think that's magnificent.